Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Doyenne by Anne Malcom, narrated by Emma Wilder. 1. I've always been fascinated with my own death. Not suicidal. It's important to make that distinction. But inappropriately interested in my demise. Since I'd gotten to what most people would consider the peak in my professional life, I'd stare off into the distance from the 48th floor, idly wondering about what would happen if I found a way to break the glass and hurl myself into the air. I felt myself falling, imagined in detail the impact of the ground, the way my bones would shatter, my organs burst. My skull would explode, and the brains that had gotten me to that spot on the 48th floor of my ivory tower would be nothing more than gray matter. I didn't take the subway. People like me had drivers. But I had daydreams about wandering down into the bowels of New York and hurling myself in front of an oncoming train. I was desperate to experience my death over and over again. Safely within the confines of my own mind, of course. But then again, safety was a farce. My own mind was more dangerous than a fall from 48 stories. Not tonight, though. No, tonight, the streets of New York that I strolled in $1,000 heels were more dangerous than even my poisonous mind. I'd spent my adulthood working my well-toned ass off trying to break through every stereotype that worked as a wall to progress. I smashed my way through glass ceilings, kicked through walls, all the while not damaging my 6-inch heels. I clawed my way up a ladder that only catered to middle-aged men, forced my way into the old boys club, and did everything to break the mold patriarchy had created for my sex. And I didn't even chip a nail. It was a daily struggle. Even now, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, I was fighting for legitimacy. I'd become comfortable with it, worked it to my advantage in most situations. By no stretch of the imagination did I like the misogynistic, sexist, elitist environment, but I accepted that it was something I would most likely have to fight against for the rest of my life. I just didn't think my life would be so short. Nor did I think my life would be ended, ironically, in a manner that reinforced every patriarchal ideology I'd been fighting against, that I'd built my life on.
On your knees, bitch.
Yeah, the helpless woman in a dark alley rendered incapacitated in a laughably short amount of time, despite her weekly Krav Maga classes. The trope that I'd battled against so violently would be the one that killed me. Despite my utter abhorrence for fairy tales, I wouldn't mind a white knight and his furry steed to be riding in right about now. Even his chubby brother on a donkey would be welcomed. Cold steel bit into my neck, and a blossom of pain exploded in my collarbone.
You fucking deaf?
The voice snarled, rank breath close enough to taste.
I said, on your fucking knees.
The intention behind such a command had my stomach roiling. I was about to be raped, potentially killed afterward. Rape and murder happened to other people. It was tragic, heartbreaking, despicable, and something you witnessed from a distance, not something you experienced. But rape and murder didn't know the bounds of class or wealth, or the ignorant confidence I'd been feeling on the subject prior to now. I'd been convinced life had dealt me my share of tragedy, of ugly violence, that I was done. But tragedy and violence were not finite. The knife pressed in harder, hard enough to draw blood that dribbled down my collarbone and trickled onto my white suit jacket. I just got this dry cleaned, I thought, my inner voice sounding cold, detached, exactly like my outer one. It didn't take much work to convince the world that I was cold and unfeeling. It took a heck of a lot more to convince myself. But I did it, My life up until right now had depended on it. I jutted my chin up, despite the pain, despite the terror almost paralyzing me, despite the overwhelming urge to do anything to save my life. Would it be a life worth saving if I sacrificed everything I'd made myself into? Everything I'd escaped? If I sacrificed the one thing I might not be able to get back? My sanity? I'd worked too hard to maintain that, and losing it would be worse than death for me. No, I replied, my voice clear, strong, unshakable, exactly as it had been when I addressed my first shareholder meeting, where I'd never been more scared in my life. Current moment excluded, obviously. I had learned to embrace that fear, change it, use it for motivation, make it bend to my will, use it as the fuel in which to power my life. The trail of blood flowed faster as the knife pressed deeper, pain a lancing sensation through my upper neck. He leaned in, eyes the only thing visible from his mask. They were empty, cold, devoid of anything. Empty like a dried-up old pool in an abandoned motel.
You think you've got a choice?
It chilled me, his utter confidence in the control he held over this situation. As if he had me in a locked room, not an alley only slightly off the bustling streets of Manhattan. Though at midnight on a Tuesday they weren't exactly bustling. It may have been the city that never slept, but it wasn't averse to a catnap. The flickering of car headlights gave me hope and despair every time they illuminated the dark corner he'd yanked me into, and then plunging me back into the transparent darkness that he'd used to his advantage to drag me into. Was it minutes ago? Or seconds? Surely Ralph would note my absence by now. I had told him when I was leaving my cosmetics offices, discouraging him from meeting me directly outside my security building. It was only a 2-minute walk, after all. I owned this block, some of the most expensive real estate in the world. What was the worst that could happen? I wondered if this was what everyone felt, what everyone did. Clung to a flimsy hope that surely this couldn't happen to them. This was a nightmare. The real world would bustle in and save the day. But maybe this was the real world. Cruel, empty, and unsympathetic. And, ultimately, fatal. Death didn't come with a crescendo, a warning, or at a time when you were ready. No, death came when you were hurrying the 2 blocks from a meeting that ran long and were snatched by the collar of your custom-made jacket. I tried to mimic that same coldness in my eyes as I regarded him, my blood pulsing. I have control over whether I willingly kneel in front of the man holding a knife to my neck, like a coward. I spat the word with a hot fury that cut through the previous chill in my voice. Something flickered in his eyes. Rage. Even that was welcomed. A human emotion beneath the inhuman film over his eyes gave me something to grasp onto. He was no longer just a monster, but a human. But maybe that was worse, seeing the monster inside a human rather than the human inside the monster. Then it was gone. The human, the monster, the slice of time that had opened up in between my rape and murder for such philosophical contemplation. A blinding pain erupted in my legs, and I crumpled down onto the concrete, my knees jarring as I made contact with the unyielding stone. He bent down, his figure blurred as my body tried to reconcile the physical pain and mental terror.
Control is something a bitch like you thinks she has, with your fucking companies and your titles that you got from opening your legs,
he hissed, the knife pressing deeper now. It was surprising, the pain. I'd heard and read about victims going numb in the face of such things, but I'd lived my life making sure I was numb, so it made sense that my death would be nothing but pain.
I'm the one who holds the blade inches from your femoral artery.
He moved it, dragging the tip along my skin. More pain.
I'm the one with the control. Power.
He whispered the last word, the truth of the statement as cutting as the knife itself.
You have nothing. You are nothing. This is where you should be, where you belong.
He yanked the back of my head back, using my hair as a handhold so my entire neck was exposed and the sharp edge of the knife poised to slit my throat. Like all the times I'd seen myself hurtling from my office to the street, I felt him rip through my skin, through the flesh, to the bone. I visualized the blood gushing down the front of my jacket, spilling onto the concrete, my body collapsing and finally bleeding out. I saw it all in the handful of seconds he kept the knife pressed there, a promise of death. Tears edged out of my eyes as I gritted my teeth to stop from crying out. It was something I was itching to do, scream for help, shriek like a banshee for any form of assistance. All my life I'd refused help, now I yearned for it. But the steel at my throat hindered that. I blinked at him through my tears, holding up a shaking arm and yanking off my watch. "Take it," I hissed, my voice garbled from the unnatural angle of my neck. "I don't have cash on me, but this is worth more than you deserve and will hopefully stop you from compensating your lack of masculinity by robbing women in the near future." Such a comment was probably not wise, considering the man could end my life in an instant. And I was smart. Very. Every decision I made in life was calculated and measured, made to propel me toward the life I wanted, and away from the life I'd been born with. This little outburst? Quite possibly the dumbest thing I'd ever done. The knife slipped from my neck for a split second as he swatted the $50,000 watch onto the pavement, where it tumbled into the shadows. I watched it bounce off the concrete, the little twang of metal against stone the loudest sound in the world, drowning out everything but my pounding heartbeat. That was it. The slipping of that knife as he was distracted by the clang of a watch against concrete. Quite possibly the only moment I'd have to save myself. And I missed it. The knife was back at my neck before I could grab the moment, perhaps the last one I'd have before he did whatever he was going to do. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear. I'd always thought I was strong, that in a life-or-death situation I'd jump into action and be the heroine. Or at least not sit like a rabbit in the headlights trying to control my bladder and terror. Yet here I was, shaking, bleeding, and almost about to wet myself. It's a confronting moment when you used to consider yourself the heroine of your own life, when in reality, all it took was a man with a knife and opportunity to turn you into the victim. And maybe you'd always been the victim. Maybe it was the cruelest thing of all to die with that stark and unadorned truth flickering in your eyes. It didn't matter how hard I worked, how many companies I owned, the corner office, the world-breaking stats. That I was on top of the world. It didn't mean I couldn't tumble down. It just meant I had a heck of a lot farther to fall. His breath was hot on my face.
Now that you're not struggling, I'll be able to do this the right way. Make it look perfect,
he murmured, his voice seductive, as if he was a lover muttering sweet nothings in my ear. Not that I knew anything about sweet nothings. The men I took to bed knew that they were there for a purpose, not affection. A single tear escaped my eye as the knife pressed deeper still, and I prepared myself for oblivion. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting the last thing I saw to be those empty eyes. In preparation for my death, the knife exerted pressure on my neck. I expected pain, a lot of it. But there wasn't any. At least, not mine. There was a grunt and the thump of a body hitting another, and the knife left my neck, cold air kissing me with its emptiness. My eyes snapped open, and in a blur of motion, the man in the mask hit the concrete viciously, and a large man on top of him threw a gun I hadn't realized my attacker possessed. It scuttled to the ground almost at my feet. I watched, transfixed, hypnotized, as the large form wrested the knife from my would-be murderer and, without hesitation, brought it across his neck. The wet, gurgling sound echoed through the open alleyway, drowning the city sounds. Death replaced whatever hustle Manhattan offered. I didn't look away. I couldn't. Instead, I watched the blood gush from the gaping wound in his neck as his body twitched and he continued to make that wet, death sound. Then, silence. The man got to his feet, staring down at the body for less than a moment. Then his attention turned to me, still on the ground, bleeding, almost wetting myself, my heart thundering with such intensity it rattled my rib cage. I didn't move, didn't speak, as his electric blue eyes glowed in the dim streetlight, fixed on me. He moved toward me, his steps even, confident. I didn't move, scream, or grab the gun inches from my shaking hands. That would have been the smart thing to do. Tonight, I wasn't smart. I wasn't the self-made woman with billion-dollar companies she built from the ground up. The CEO who graced covers of finance magazines and didn't blink at sharks in suits who made it their mission to destroy, belittle, and demean her. Tonight, I was a stranger wearing the familiar body, but inhabiting an unrecognizable mind. A cowardly one. I watched the man who had just taken a life after saving my own approach me. In that couple of seconds it took for him to get to me, I drank him in. Yes, drank him in, because he was a tall drink of water, a mountain of it. He took up my whole vision, his form swallowing the still and blood-stained corpse he'd created. He was wearing a weathered tan leather jacket with only a white tee underneath, hugging what I guessed was a lot of muscle. Jeans encased his huge thighs, and combat boots stopped in front of me. The boots were worn, like the jacket. Old, but not bad quality. I could appreciate good shoes. "Nice boots," I said, my voice dreamlike. "Though they look like they've seen a season too many. You should invest in a new pair." Silence. I guessed it was a peculiar thing to say after he'd just killed someone in front of me. He didn't bend down, ask if I was okay, call 911. None of that. His gaze just flickered over me. My own still fixated on his boots. There were splatters of red blood on them. Those small splotches hypnotized me, reflecting the death that they represented. I knew his gaze was on me, though. It was physical, the shiver that went over my body as those icy eyes traveled the length of it. The boots left my vision, going over to the side of the alley. I didn't move my eyes to watch the journey of the boots, which meant my gaze focused on the body. The blood spilling in a pool around it. My stomach roiled. That was a dead person. That could have been me, twitching, bleeding, then just a corpse splayed on the concrete of a dirty alleyway. Nothing but a stain and empty flesh. The boots returned just as my body started vibrating with the force of my shaking. He knelt down this time, and I was relieved when his face took up my vision. Not relieved enough to stop shaking, but I wasn't too far gone to appreciate his face. When confronted by the angular, sharp, utterly masculine and lethal features of a man like that, you appreciated it, even if it was seconds after he murdered someone. It was a kind of beauty that made you stop and look. Perhaps marvel. Definitely fear it. His jaw was covered in stubble that was almost a beard and cloaked half of his tanned face in shadow. The nose had been broken, its crookedness perfecting the features of what would have been too classically handsome otherwise. His hair was long, wayward, and brushing the shoulders of his leather jacket. His eyes were blank, but not empty. There was something wild about him, about those eyes, like a wolf's when venturing too close to humans. The animal in him was wild and untamed, yet it seemed to mean me no harm. They focused on me with unwavering intensity as my hand was lifted, cool steel kissing the prickled skin on my wrist. "You saved me," I whispered, my words floating into the empty air. He didn't respond, though I didn't expect it. After all, you can't talk to wolves, can you? Instead, his eyes flickered with something mixing with the wildness, but I couldn't put my finger on it because sharp pressure erupted in my wrist, and then there was nothing. No wild eyes, no weathered boots, no blood, no wolf. Just nothing.
Char, what are you doing here?
I glanced at Vaughn, who launched up from his chair and was regarding me with his perfectly manicured brow arched. "Well, that's the CEO's office." I pointed to the door, which had Charlotte Crofton engraved in sloping script. "And I'm Charlotte, the CEO, so I guess I'm in the right place," I said dryly, not stopping my journey to my door. He was quicker than me, even in heels. His patent leather Louboutins met mine, stopping me from entering my office. Now it was my turn to arch my just as perfectly manicured brow in challenge. "You need to go home," he instructed, folding his arms. I eyed him evenly. "You need to remember that I'm the one who signs your paychecks, so ordering me around is a role reversal I do not appreciate," I said. My tone was foreign, at least with Vaughn. I had a reputation for being a hard-ass to work for. Some might even call me a bitch, because assertive women were always labeled as bitches, but I wasn't that way with Vaughn. At least not at 6 a.m. when he was the first one in the deserted office, like always. Vaughn was the closest thing I had to a best friend, and I paid him for that duty. He'd been with me since I started my first company, Crofton Cosmetics, as makeup was his first love, evidenced by the flawlessly contoured and highlighted face with a cat eye sharp enough to cut steel. We enjoyed a warm relationship. Warm for me, at least. I didn't do slumber parties with ice cream and heart-to-hearts. My heart, if you listened to most of my employees, was made of ice. Or coal, depending on who you talked to. It didn't bother me. If I wanted to be at the top, enjoy the power and control afforded mostly to men in this industry, complete agency over my own life, I didn't have time to consider other people's feelings. That was not in the job description. I didn't even consider my own. Nor did I stop long enough to inspect whatever feelings that were buried deep beneath the shield I'd created to help me survive in this world. The shield that was battered, broken, and all but destroyed last night, with the knowledge that years of accruing power and agency could be snuffed out in a moment. That was something I didn't need to think about. Now. Or ever. Thinking and crying over it wouldn't change anything. The past was where ghosts lived. The present was for the living. And the dying. I'd come close enough to the latter to be determined to stay the former. This meant continuing my day as usual, as if I hadn't almost died. And my day, in fact my life, was work. This building, this company, this empire. Living, for me, was getting into the office at dawn, like always, and not leaving until well after the sun had disappeared. I focused on Vaughn, who was assessing me. He didn't even blink his thick lashes at my tone. "You were almost killed last night." His eyes went to the scarf covering the bandages at my neck. I didn't flinch, nor did my expression change. I'd hoped that I could avoid anyone commenting on that particular accessory or the reason for it. Because I was poetic, it was a blood-red vintage Hermes paired with a sharply tailored black Yves Saint Laurent pantsuit. My shoes were blood-red too. Black and red. the two colors plaguing my memories, and the precise 1 hour of sleep I'd been able to snatch after I'd spent 2 hours at the hospital and another hour getting interviewed by the police. Though that wasn't rightly true. Another color cut through them all. Ice blue, like a glacier sparkling in the sunlight, alive and yearning to break free from the earth that constrained it. "Lock it down," I instructed myself. My attention moved back to the lined eyes that were not wild but irritated and concerned. "Ralph called you," I surmised. He nodded. "He was under strict instructions not to do so. In fact, that's in breach of his confidentiality agreement," I said tightly. Ralph was my driver, had been for the last 6 years, and those 6 years had been eventful, to say the least. The media loved a woman working her way up from nothing and becoming a success in a man's world, apparently. After I moved from a well-established cosmetics brand I'd built from the ground up and moved to tech and security software companies, I'd become somewhat of a sensation in the media. Being a woman and a CEO of a makeup company was somewhat accepted. Lipstick and mascara were the woman's domain. Not my words, but a male writer for the Financial Times. But a security software company with international and government contracts? No. A woman couldn't be trusted with that. With all our emotions. Not with national security at stake. Could we make the country vulnerable to attack just because a suit with boobs had a bad bout of PMS? That one wasn't the Financial Times, but from one of my direct competitors. Another male. Regardless of gender, he was wrong. I'd put every single cent of profit I'd gained from my cosmetics company into investing in a high-risk, high-return startup. That moment could have broken me. I would have been bankrupt and damn near destitute had my venture failed. But it didn't fail. Our security firm was the top in the business and leading the way in the IT sector. I was ice cold and more ruthless than most of the people leading the attacks I was defending against. That was child's play, as were the men who tried to doubt me. The worst attacks didn't come from anywhere outside. It was when I looked inward that trouble began. Ralph was loyal to a fault. He'd been with me since I made enough to afford a driver and turned into a driver/bodyguard when it became apparent I needed that, too. I had some death threats, a couple of borderline violent confrontations. Nothing serious, but something that Ralph had made sure he took care of. That, in turn, made me change his job description and up his salary. And also add some points to the non-disclosure. I didn't precisely think I'd need such a frivolous piece of paper. He was unlikely to sell any details of my life to the tabloids, no matter how much they offered. This was because I paid him well, and because he was loyal. Or so I thought. Vaughn rolled his eyes. "Seriously? You're talking about confidentiality agreements when you were almost fucking murdered?" His voice ended on a slight screech. "Vaughn," he held up his manicured hand. The long nails were curved into sharp points, hot pink and rhinestones today. "Don't Vaughn me," he snapped. "I want to know why Ralph had to call me and then threaten bodily harm if I came down to the hospital, which, if I didn't like my face so much, I would have." He paused. "I even drove halfway there. You're worth risking plastic surgery for. Plus, I've been thinking of getting a new nose anyway." He scrunched up the aforementioned nose. "What the question should be is why Ralph had to call me. Why didn't you?" I frowned. "Why would I call you?" He tilted his head to the ceiling. "Are you insane?" The question, though more hysterical than literal, speared through the broken edges of my shield. I sharpened my gaze. "Not that I'm aware of, though asking such a question to your employer could be considered so." Vaughn ignored this. "You were mugged at knife point, then taken to a hospital. You should have called me." I folded my arms. "Why? What would calling you have done?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?